All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 14, Section 3, the Dred Scott Decision and Sectional Strife. So, against the background of bleeding Kansas and the violence going on in both Washington, D.C. and Kansas, came a Supreme Court decision that only further ignited the differences between the free states and the slave states, and is probably one of the most infamous Supreme Court cases in all of American history, and that is the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. I believe this was 1857, I want to say. Dred Scott is the individual that you see pictured right here. He was a slave who had spent some time living in free territory. Essentially, his slaveholder or owner had brought Dred Scott with him to live in Wisconsin, which was a free territory. Dred Scott said or made the claim that because he lived in free soil, he should therefore be free. So Dred Scott sued. That decision ultimately went to the Supreme Court, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Again, this was, should Scott be free having lived, in free soil? That was ultimately the question. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Chief Justice Roger Taney, a Southerner, a former slaveholder, and he came down with the decision. So initially, this question was only about Dred Scott himself. However, the Supreme Court also used this decision to talk more broadly about the status of slavery in the United States, in the Western territories, and just broadly about people of African descent or Black people in the United States. What they ruled, number one, was Dred Scott would remain a slave. So the idea that Dred Scott should be free, he was rejected by the Supreme Court. So we'll say on the first count, we might say that Scott was not free. But the Supreme Court also took the opportunity to also speak more broadly about these other issues. In the decision, in terms of citizenship, Roger Taney and the Supreme Court ruled that people of African descent, or, Black people, could not be citizens. And this was important because this was not just dealing with the issue of slavery, but this also included the about 500,000 free Black people who were living in the United States at the time. And this was coming down from the Supreme Court, essentially shutting the door to any idea that people of African descent would be integrated into American society. So this had far further repercussions than simply the issue of slavery. It essentially looked towards the abolitionists and contradicted what the abolitionists stood for. That was the abolition of slavery and the full extension of rights under citizenship. Additionally, and this is what got really Congress and those politicians of the North, hot and bothered, you might say, was that the Supreme Court also ruled that Congress, or congressional power, that Congress had no power to prevent slavery in the territories. Right? That Congress has no power to prevent slavery in the territories. According to Roger Taney, this was, slaves were considered property, and if people wanted to bring their property to whatever territory they wanted to, they legally had the right to do so. So this decision really came down sort of on three things. One, Dred Scott would not be free. Two, Black people in the United States could never be citizens. And three, Congress had no power to prohibit slavery anywhere. So not only did this overturn the Missouri Compromise, but it also made popular sovereignty as unconstitutional, right? And opened up pretty much all the remaining territories to the possibility of slavery. Now, this got especially Northerners, up in arms about this particular issue. That this was essentially an effort to try and nationalize slavery, even in the free territories. You combine what happened with Kansas, Nebraska, with the decision on Dred Scott, and now suddenly there's all sorts of free soil, right? Soil that slavery had been historically prohibited to, potentially being opened up to slavery. And so it's against this backdrop that in the state of Illinois, a free state, an election over a Senate seat takes place in 1858. Now, it just so happens that Stephen Douglas, who is probably one of the most well-known political figures at the time, he is a Democrat, and he is running for this Senate seat. He's challenged by a local unknown politician named Abraham Lincoln, who had previously been a Whig, but then becomes a member of the Republican Party. Lincoln, for a short time, had spent a brief stint in politics opposing the Mexican-American War. He then didn't get elected, and pretty much up until Kansas, Nebraska had been retired. When Kansas, Nebraska was passed, this was such an egregious law that Lincoln came out of retirement and entered into politics again. And these two had debates around Illinois. And what's interesting about the Lincoln-Douglas debates is that this is only for a local Senate seat, right? This is not necessarily, it is a national position, but, Lincoln or Douglas, they're only going to represent Illinois in the Senate. But when they go and debate across Illinois, every single time, the debate goes back to the issue of slavery, to the issue of Kansas, Nebraska, popular sovereignty. What's your idea about Dred Scott? Did the Supreme Court make the wrong or right decision? And a lot of people tuned into the debate to hear what Douglas had to say, who you see pictured right here, because he was the more well-known national figure. And when they read the debates, they actually became much more familiar with Abraham Lincoln and liked what Lincoln had to say. So we might say that the Lincoln-Douglas debates gave Lincoln a national platform and really made him popular, right? These debates is really what sort of catapults him into a much more well-known political figure. Stephen Douglas in these debates, attempted to slander Lincoln and the Republican Party. Douglas played on people's racist views, racial prejudices, racial fears, saying that Lincoln was an advocate of miscegenation. Miscegenation is essentially race mixing or interracial marriage. And labeling and calling Lincoln the Black Republican Party. Essentially, the Democratic Party is the party of the white man. The Republican Party is the party of the black man. Don't vote for Abraham Lincoln. And what Lincoln did and what made him so popular in these debates is that, he counterbalanced or responded to these accusations by, really, hearkening on the idea of American principles. Viewing slavery as something that's antithetical with something like the Declaration of Independence. And this was, Lincoln was a little bit more of a moderate on this particular issue, still, claiming at this point that he had no intention of ending slavery where it existed, only preventing it from spreading any further. But perhaps one of his most famous speeches, maybe the most famous speech Lincoln gave during these debates, and it's called the House Divided speech, and it eerily foreshadowed what happened in the future. Lincoln said, "A house divided," and again, the house that he's talking about here is a metaphor for the country, right? A house divided against itself cannot stand, right? The country cannot remain divided on this issue. Lincoln said it's going to be all one or all the other, right? That the country is going to have to be either entirely free or entirely slave. Of course, Lincoln, being the Northerner that he is, and what his stance on slavery is, this is, he's obviously advocating for a nation in which slavery is abolished everywhere, and Southerners would remember this, by the time that he became president. Stephen Douglas, he said, whatever, it's been half and half up until this point. It can stay half and half forever. However, though, Stephen Douglas did disagree with the Dred Scott decision. The Freeport Doctrine was something issued by Douglas, and this was Douglas's support of popular sovereignty. Douglas, he's someone that, really doesn't care whether or not a territory becomes free or slave. What he cares the most about is the idea that, the democratic process takes place. And so the fact that Douglas continues to stick to popular sovereignty rather than the clear pro-slavery position loses him a lot of votes for the South and damages his status as a national figure, especially amongst Southerners. However, it is good enough in the free state of Illinois, right? They, like the idea of popular sovereignty. It wasn't an explicit pro-slavery position. And Douglas ended up winning the election in 1858. However, the significance here is not that Lincoln lost the election. The significance here is that now Lincoln is a national voice, a national moderate voice, a well-received voice on the issue of slavery and its expansion.